So we're going to look at chapter 15, the last sections 4 to 10, and we'll be looking at the contradictions of technology, class struggle, and the system dynamics in the capitalist mode of production. And I'll come on to the reading comments at the end. Just very quickly, in terms of where we are, we're looking at relative surplus value, which is really at the heart of Marx's argument in volume 1. And it is quite striking how much he writes in the rest of the chapter about the Factory Acts and how much he refers back to the material he told us about in developing the idea of absolute surplus value. And he will combine absolute and relative surplus value in a chapter or two's time, when he'll be looking at how intensity combines with both. What I'm pointing out is that there's also a combination with higher degrees of exploitation, and this is a thread which we'll come on to as we run through. And how Marx deals with it, I think, is a matter for critical development, I would say. Marx's main focus moving forward from this chapter is he uses a lot of the material to develop what is later called the general law of accumulation. And it is very striking how much he sort of begins to develop the dynamics from relative surplus value in the direction of capital accumulation, as at the same time being a reproduction of a social class relation. In chapter 15, the first 3 sections which we've been looking at are just summarizing here. There was an issue in section 2 of chapter 15. It's a very terse comment, but it turns out to be extremely important in terms of Marx's explanation for the driving dynamic of capitalism, which he says on page 512, when an individual commodity, as labor productivity rises, the value of the commodity will decrease. And that's, of course, what the capitalists want to do. They want to cheapen their commodity to undersell their competitors. But what he also says is that the new value decreases. And that means that this is something which is very important to grasp. And the other way of putting it is that the proportion of the constant capital decreases absolutely at the same time as it increases relatively. That's the way Marx puts it. And what I've done here is using the type of figures which Marx himself is using. I've just added on the right, and I'm not going to walk through it now, but if you are wrestling with that idea, that concept, I've just done a worked example, which I think illustrates what Marx is saying. The other big point from section 2 of chapter 15 is what Marx points out is that whether or not an individual capitalist will adopt new technology, put in the machinery, or reorganize production and increase labor productivity, depends on if it's to their benefit, in sort of like in cost benefit analysis and capitalist terms. What's the capitalist rationale? Well, they have to be able to produce more cheaply by bringing in machinery. Now, what that means is that they evaluate the cost of producing by machine, using machines and increasing labor productivity, against how cheap the labor power is that the machine production would replace. And what you find, therefore, is Marx identifies this, and it's a very important dynamic and he uses the example of introduction of machines in the United States, which were not introduced in England at the time, where the wage differential would have been significant, but nowhere near as significant as the sort of wage differential we're looking at today between rich countries in the world and poor countries in the world, and say England and Iran, for example, right? But even in England at the time, he's a really arresting example indeed, is that poor women were so cheap that they were being used to pull barges. The labor power cost hardly anything for the capitalists. So rather than bring in any mechanized way of barges being pulled along, women workers would do. So that was a sort of very awful example of what he's getting at. Section 3, I'm not going to go into detail, it is in the last lecture, but this is just a reminder, is incredibly powerful section. And what Marx is doing here is he's saying when machines are introduced, other things happen at the same time, and capitalism also increases exploitation of the working class as it's introducing machinery. And he points out 3 ways that this happens. And one is that use of machines allows a capitalist to use more child and female labor, juveniles as well. And he says this will increase the degree of exploitation. It's actually, he says at one point, it reintroduces or introduces into production layers of social layers which weren't in production before. Another major point he makes is in relation to the increasing in relative surplus value can also go alongside increasing in absolute surplus value by prolonging the working day. And he sees this as an imminent contradiction, that the application of machinery for the production of surplus value cannot, he also points out that there's a limit. That's what the point he's making here. Sorry, he's saying, okay, you can increase the length of the working day, which means that capitalists can increase the amount of surplus value, but there is a limit to it. In other words, if you've got fewer workers, there's only so much you can increase their working day, and you reach a limit of 24 hours. And how can you exploit workers more than getting them to work 24 hours? So there's a contradiction that moves and reaches a limit, he's saying here. And the third point he makes is that the introduction of machinery often goes alongside with intensifying labor, which is that workers have to work more hard with less breaks. He uses the term porosity of labor, you know, just no gaps in the work. It's sort of like heavy production line. The rhythm of work is intensified and increased. Okay, so these are 3 methods of increasing surplus value. Whoever's got their mic on, do you mind turning it off? Can you mute yourselves, please? The other point, which is just because we're going to come back onto this, is Marx notes a huge expansion of production after 1848. You will remember that 1848 was when the 10-hour day Factory Act legislation came into force. It was only on certain sectors that it came into force. And when it came into force, it limited how long workers in those sectors could work. They shouldn't be working for more than 10 hours a day. But what capital did is within those 10 hours, it made workers work more intensely, work harder. And it was also an impulse to introduce a lot more machinery. And you can see here in terms of this is cotton exports, but it signals overall cotton production. You can see that in the space of, how many years is that? 16, 17 years, the amount of cotton production that was exported went up 2.5 times. And that is a fair indicator of overall production, but that's just the indicator he happened to use. Okay, so you saw a massive boom in this sort of leading sector of the capitalist economy at the time. Now, the point which he begins to come on to, and I'm going to comment on further, is of course this increased production also required increased raw materials. And so as well as exports increasing, they would have needed to import an awful lot more raw cotton, for example, in order to feed this cotton production. And this is a sort of an overall point I'm going to make before I go into the detail. This is a slight comment on Marx, the world market and colonialism. Now, Marx has already, when he's talking about a division of labor, contrasted his position with Smith. He's saying that Smith made no real difference between the division of labor inside an enterprise and division of labor in society, whereas Marx sees that there is a difference in kind between the two. He thinks that within a capitalist enterprise, which at that time of Smith's time was more of a workshop than a factory, he sees that, you know, the capitalist is planning what's going on. They're in charge. They direct. They decide how many people do this, do that, and the other. But within the capitalist system, there's very little planning when you look at the social division of labor, where the sort of connection is made through the market. So there's a sort of a disorganization in that sense. It's allowed to the forces of competition, which of course Smith believed were sort of inherently benign and harmonious, and Marx takes a very opposite view. So there's a distinction there about how the division of labor works at the level of the national society. But it does prompt a question when we're talking about the sort of exports and imports in particular. What about the division of labor at the international level? I think it would be fair to say that in general, in Capital, in the 3 volumes that we have, Marx is normally looking at the national market. And he does, as I've already noted, look at the sort of the dynamic of capitalist expansion of exports. But he doesn't really analyze the world market as such. And in fact, Marx had penciled in, certainly originally when he started the project, that he would write 3 further volumes on international trade, on the state and the world market. So as far as he got, you are looking at a sort of a national production, which stands for the system as a whole. And he also does use in many international examples. I mean, in particularly relevant are slavery in the United States, colonial occupation of India and Ireland, amongst others. But he tends to use them as sort of points of contrast, sort of compare and contrast, to contrast slavery with wage labor, for example, as we've already seen. Okay, so Marx had an incredibly wide and deep encyclopedic knowledge. But I think there are some issues about his use of these compare and contrast examples. I mean, evidently some of his sources were very questionable, like British Army officers writing about ancient Indian societies was also, you know, part of the colonial project. And I also think it would be fair to say that more than once, if it's not itself an overgeneralization, Marx has a slight tendency to overgeneralize these other societies. We can talk about that. But the main issue that I'm concerned with, in any case, is not only about comparison. It is a developing international capitalist system. So the mode of production and circulation was international, but it was a differentiated internationality. And so the question of the relations between the different nodes of this developing international system, I think, were already important in Marx's time. And again, the obvious example is cotton, but there are other examples of what today we call capitalist commodity chains. And so there is a question of what perspective Marx is giving us, and it's clear. I mean, in a most innocent sense, if you like, he's Anglo-centric. He looks at it from the development of capitalism in Britain. There are contributors in the literature now which really point out that in the last decade or so of his life, in the 1870s, Marx embarked on a massive new round of study, incredibly wide his reading, and he was looking at lots of different societies. But I would say that this doesn't convert into his incorporate this into any sort of development beyond what he's got that we're going to look at in the 3 volumes of the theory of surplus value. There's one exception which we spotted in the back in the early part of chapter 15, and we're going to look at some more exceptions. And this is an area of concern that I want to sort of note and highlight, right? Which is how Marx begins to deal with the international, if you like, and the sort of what is the totality of the system? Is it assumed to be a national, or does it include international relations? Okay, that's all preparatory. Now let's get on to the new content. So section 4, the factory, and this one is a contemporary photograph. Evidently, this is known as the first Industrial Revolution factory by Arkwright. This is in the Peak District. You can go and visit it if you're in England, you can. And he quotes Tom Ure, I think Thomas, I can't remember his first name, but Ure is one of the sort of champions really of the Industrial Revolution. And he gives the factory two descriptions. The first one is where the combined collective worker appears as the dominant subject and the mechanical automaton as the object. And in the other one, the automaton, that's the machinery in the system of machinery, it's itself the subject. This is, I mean, just for brevity, I haven't given you the you'll read it, but this is Marx's summary of what Ure is saying, right? And what Marx tells us, right, he makes a really important distinction, right? It is possible to have machinery without having capitalism. And so the first description, that there is a collective worker, would apply to the use of machinery and to the large-scale industry, the development of factory type, quite large points of collection of workers. That could apply to a mode of production beyond capitalism, let's put it like that. But the second, where the machinery becomes the subject, that is a characteristic of machine production under capitalism, Marx argues, and it's a characteristic of the modern factory system. This is a very important point, and it's an example of what not just I, but you know, the literature commenting on this from Marx himself. He's looking at a dialectic under capitalism between the social relations of production and the forces of production, okay, as they apply in capitalism. And he's already raising the point that it doesn't have to be this way. It's not like a technological deterministic argument. He is saying that under capitalism, technology will take particular forms, and there are reasons for it, but that's because of the capitalist social relation over determining the technology, making use of it. What he sees is, he doesn't use the term alienation, but it's a well-known term from the early Marx, right? And what he's talking about is that the skill of the worker goes over to the machine. It's kind of like appropriated by capital and incorporated in the mechanisms of the machine. And then Marx goes on to differentiate three roles for the worker. I mean, this is particularly so in cotton mills, and I think the roles might be different according to the industrial sector. But he talks about the workers who are actually employed on the machines, they're sort of tending or operating machines, and those who feed them, if you like. The children in the cotton mills are often used just to feed in the machines, right? And then he's got a third group. He says that those two that I've just mentioned are the two most important groups. And then there is a third group, which is much smaller in actual fact, who are the ones who, if the machines break down, they need fixing on the job type thing, and they would be engineers and mechanics and so on. He thinks that this is extremely hideous, the way it works under capitalism. And we've already seen that under manufacturing, the workers are forced to become highly specialized and handling only a particular range of tools and very repetitive work. This is even more accentuated with the adoption of machine production. And it's not just that they're handling the same tool, it's just that they're serving the same machine. So the sort of the alienation involved is increasing all the time, right? It's qualitatively worse, I would say, right? Okay, and so all the time Marx is saying we can distinguish between increased productivity due to the development of social process of production and increased productivity which is characteristic of the exploitation by capital of the forces of production. This is a really important point. So there's Arkwright, the one who was known to be the author or inventor of the factory. He also was, he did actually make his own invention, but he was a bit like the guy who set up Microsoft. He managed to rob a lot of other inventions. He was good at robbing other people's work. And Marx makes a point here is the inversion of the subject and the object. And this is a quote from Marx: in handicrafts and manufacture, the worker makes use of a tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of him. It's reminded, I did find it reminiscent of Malcolm X talking about Plymouth Rock. When the English arrived at Plymouth Rock, they dropped on Plymouth Rock. When Africans arrived, the rock dropped on them. I mean, this is a complete inversion Marx is pointing to. Okay. Even the lightening of labor becomes an instrument of torture, since the machine does not free the worker from the work, but rather deprives the work itself of all content. Every kind of capitalist production, as far as it's not only a labor process, but also capital's process of valorization, has this in common. But it is not the worker who employs the conditions of his work, but rather the reverse. The conditions of work employ the worker. However, it is only with the coming of machinery that this inversion first acquires a technical and palpable reality. So the machinery, Marx is saying, becomes the subject, and the workers are reduced to the objectified in this relation. And he uses the term automaton. So basically, the instrument of labor is that which confronts the worker, and it is as capital that the machines confront the worker. What this also means is the separation of the intellectual aspect of the production process, which was still with handicraft workers, diminished under manufacturing production, and even further diminished under machine production in capitalist conditions, right? So the powers, the intellectual role that the worker has in the production process is more and more appropriated by capital, and machinery sort of like encapsulates that, right? There is a big tie-in with chapter 10 on the working day, and Marx writes time and time again in this chapter also about the awful and health and safety conditions that the capitalists are imposing on the worker. The workers raged against the machine. In this section, the struggle between the worker and the machine, that's what Marx starts with. So there was a class struggle of workers against the instrument of labor, and the most famous example is the Luddites, and this is a picture of Luddites smashing up one of Cartwright's machines, Arkwright's machines actually. Marx also points to the effect on the dispossessed rural poor. Okay, this has been, it is a centuries process in England. He's talking about England here. And what he found, he's talking about in the manufacturing period, is the demand of the colonial markets accentuated the removal of the removal poor and the dissolution of the feudal system. What he also points out is, in terms of rural workers, how much this was violent, and this is sort of what he later on developed, we know, in the so-called primitive accumulation of capital. Okay, but he's sort of saying that the introduction of machine industry had this sort of broader effects on the relation of classes. He's beginning to really anticipate the general law of accumulation, and at this point he's looking at it in terms of the relationship superseding manufacture and going into machine production and superseding handicraft. Okay, now the self-valorization of capital by means of the machine is related directly to the number of workers whose conditions of existence have been destroyed by it. The whole system of capitalist production is based on the worker's sale of his labor power as a commodity. The division of labor develops this labor power in a one-sided way by reducing it to the highly particularized skill of handling a special tool. This is manufacturing, we've covered this. When it becomes the job of the machine to handle this tool, the use value of the worker's labor power vanishes, and with it its exchange value. The worker becomes unsaleable, like paper money thrown out of currency by legal enactment. And he gives an example of weavers. So in the basically mechanization started first in the spinning, and it proved a bit harder to make the hand looms work in a machine-like way. But they did, after about 20 or 30 years, capitalists managed to also mechanize weaving using the loom. So you had machine looms. And there was a huge crisis as a result in terms of what happened to these. Of course, there were now hundreds of thousands of weavers because there was so much production in the cotton spinning. I think there was something like 400,000 or more, 500,000 or more weavers producing to keep up with all the yarn that was being produced in the cotton factories, in the yarn factories. But then in turn, when the weaving became mechanized, you had a massive expelling of workers who were weavers. And he writes about this, and he gives two examples. One is England, where the hand loom weavers, many of them died of starvation, as he says there. And he points to an even more acute effect in India. Okay, and this is a quote. So basically, by this time, you're beginning to see goods produced in England being exported back to India, whereas before Indian cotton goods were both better and cheaper. But with the industrialization, it was possible to at least cheaper goods being sent back to India. And so the Governor General reports as follows: the misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. I should be a bit more precise here. I think actually at this point in the 1830s, it wasn't that English cotton goods were as yet being sent to India. It's just that Indian goods were being undercut in other markets. They were being outcompeted by this time by English produced goods. Now, what's this one? I'll just move this around, a bit too tight. I don't know if I can get rid of that. Okay. So the estrangement of the worker is not only from what they produce, which is part of the capitalist mode of production, right? It's not only from the product of labor, but it's a complete antagonism with the machinery. That's the point that Marx is making here. So there's a revolt against the influence of labor themselves. Now that was in the early phase, if you like, where machinery takes over from handicraft and manufacturing. But the machines become part of a system of machinery, and it becomes self-reproducing, right? In the sense that this direct antagonism between the worker and the machine passes over into, if you like, a normalized situation, but it's still extremely antagonistic, where basically all the time large-scale industry is trying to improve the machinery and increase all the time labor productivity in order to make higher profits. So you have a sort of like an automatic system of antagonism with machinery, right? And what you also have, once it takes hold, is the machine system's extraordinary capacity for expansion. And he's getting on now to the phase after 1848, in the 20 years immediately before he writes volume 1, where he's seeing that there's a tremendous strides. And the big example he gives is the cotton industry. And he talks about the galloping pace, which was a further stimulus in the 1860s. Now this is one example. Carding is a sort of combing of the cotton before it's spun, before it becomes yarn and then spun into thread. We formerly had 75 carding engines. Now we have 12 doing the same quantity of work. We are doing with fewer hands at a saving of wages of £10 a week. So what you've got is, you know, continuing improvement using machinery, fewer and fewer workers, bigger and bigger machines. But also, Marx connects this, and this is the theme throughout this chapter, this expansion of production reached a point where they began to not be able to sell all the stuff that they were producing, a glut in the world market. He does point to 2 or 3 recessions or crises of production, and one came about 1866, 1867, right? And in this crisis of overproduction of cotton, they couldn't sell it, basically, cotton goods, they began to attack workers' wages and forcibly reduce workers' wages by 5%. Okay, there was resistance, and what the workers said, I don't put it all in the quote because we've got enough quotes already probably, but the workers said, well, why don't you get us working 4 days a week? I mean, that was a perfectly rational response of the workers. Don't cut our wages, just you know, we'll take a bit more time off, thank you very much, which of course the capitalists wouldn't allow them to do. So, but what you've got here within the capitalist system is what he's recording is capitalists pushing down wages when we go into crisis, when the system begins to go into crisis. Okay. This picture is of actually Leeds Museum. They have a self-acting mule working. You can watch the video. It's not very exciting, but what you can see is there's a mechanism to just to get an idea of it. And so this sort of carriage goes up and down, the threads all along here. You can't see it very well in this photo. The attendant doesn't have to do very much unless something goes wrong. And then they have to reconnect the thread, or, you know, not muck around, that's not the right word. I mean, they have skill, but it's sort of auxiliary to the mechanism. This is a self-acting machine. That's the point. That's a development of machinery to the point where they're running themselves to a large degree. Okay. Now, what Marx records is interesting, because when we looked at chapter 10, there was a slight feeling that he could have brought in more of the class struggle into the chapter. He does bring in the class struggle here, and he says that these self-acting machines were often brought in the context of suppressing strikes. So if the workers were on strike, then the capitalists had a new momentum to try and get rid of more workers and bring in these sort of self-acting mechanisms, reducing the workforce that they were required. Okay, so he's talking about these machines being weapons against working class revolt. And he also records that, you know, he uses evidence from the employers themselves. I think this is an employer, Mr. Fairburn. He's saying, you know, he was this is exactly what he was doing when those workers went on strike. He worked out a way to how he could get rid of more workers by changing the machinery. So you can see that there's a very direct interaction between the forces of production and relations of production that Marx is giving us here. So this one is compensation. The compensation argument was put forward by bourgeois economists, and they basically said, I mean, they said, well, yeah, okay, so machines do mean that it puts some workers out of work, but hey, don't worry too much, because workers being put out of work at one sector means that capital is also freed up and they can be employed by capital investing in other sectors. It was a very disingenuous argument, which Marx puts quite a lot of effort into showing is just clearly just not the case, right? But he uses this argument as a peg around, you know, he critiques the apologists of capitalism, but from that critique he develops a good explanation of what's going on, right? And he says, oh, so the workers are driven out by machinery and they're thrown onto the labor market. But what that does is, you know, it increases the number of workers, labor powers, who are at the disposal of capitalist exploitation. And he says what happens in reality is not benign at all. If they get jobs, it's very often at a lower rate and under worse conditions, underpaid and oversupplied branches. Okay, so yeah, the workers find other work, but you know, it's not like they have no choice but to find other work, but it's under worse conditions. So he's beginning now to move beyond the sort of like the individual factory here but he's moved from the individual machine to the factory. Now he's also looking at the dynamics of the system. And this is what when I say, what is the unit of analysis here? He is looking at dynamics of the system, within a national society and economy. Okay. Now this is a basic thing about why, it's a sort of a law, if you like, of this developed productivity. If the total quantity of the article produced by machinery is equal to the total quantity of the article previously produced by a handicraft or by manufacture and now made by machinery, then the total labor is diminished. Okay, total labor expended is diminished, right? Because each workers are more productive. So if you've got the same amount of stuff, same number of articles being produced, it's going to be done with fewer workers. The increase in the labor required to produce the instruments of labor themselves, the machinery, coal, etc., must be less than the reduction in labor achieved by the employment of machinery. I mean, it doesn't make sense to employ machinery if actually it costs more labor to make the machines than is saved in the use of the machines. As a matter of fact, the total quantity of the article produced by machinery with a diminished number of workers, instead of remaining equal to the total quantity of the handmade article that has been displaced, exceeds this by far. Once the machines come in, they just start to produce, labor working with machines produces more and more stuff, right? More and more use values. When I say stuff, that's use values, right? Hence, the use of machinery extends in a given industry. As the use of machinery extends in a given industry, the immediate effect is to increase production in other industries that provide the first with means of production. Okay, this makes sense, I think, right? So let's have a look at that. Okay, so what about the industries producing the means of production? Well, Marx actually makes a differentiation here. Now we are beginning to come on to the international. In terms of the industries making the machines, right, Marx is saying that they're actually quite technologically developed in a sense that there's a lot of use of machinery in the making of machines. And if you look at the numbers, just look at this number. He says the total number of people employed in production machinery was 61,000 in England and Wales, more or less. Okay, 61,000 making the machines. But the other means of production is the raw materials. And if we go back to the mainstay argument about cotton, he points out that United States by 1861, there were nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans. In actual fact, he also gives another example, which is to do with the woolen industry and the driving of people off the land to make space for the sheep. Okay, so you have big impacts in the supply of raw materials, and Marx is aware of this, and he's drawing the reader's attention to it. So just to add to that, I mean, the proportions are quite important here. I think of these 4 million, if you want, it's a bit problematic how you estimate it, but probably about 1 million enslaved laborers were directly producing cotton. And of those, about 80% probably were producing cotton that ended up in Britain. And he's saying that in the cotton-based industries, there were about 2/3 of a million of wage workers in the UK at the time. So just look at these numbers. There were similar numbers of enslaved workers producing the cotton as were employed as wage workers in working up the cotton into cotton goods. But both of these are far bigger, by an order of magnitude more, than the workers involved in producing machinery. So the point I'm making is that there's a huge issue as labor becomes more productive, not only about the labor which produces the machines that enable it to be more productive, but the labor that produces the raw materials that are also used through the higher degree of productivity. So this one is an extremely important chapter, section of the chapter. It's almost a chapter in its own right because they're quite extensive discussions, right? And I mean, this is just summarizing big points Marx is making here, right? How production is expanded, how constant capital rises compared in relation to variable capital, more and more money. The capitalist is spending more and more money on buying machinery and raw materials as compared to the money they're paying out in wages, right? He's looking at the number of workers employed in terms of the size of capital. As workers are expelled from production, how many are left? And he does begin to link this to the international division of labor. And he also links that to, as I already mentioned in the case of cotton industry, to the dynamics of the system in terms of periodic crises due to profitability falling. So this is quite a lot here, right? In terms of international division of labor, okay, the general conditions of production appropriate to large-scale industry have been established. Once it's been established, this mode of production requires an elasticity, a capacity for sudden extension by leaps and bounds, which comes up against no barriers but those presented by the availability of raw materials and the extent of sales outlets, both of which international. So increase in the supply of raw material. On the other hand, the cheapness of the articles are made using machinery means that they're weapons for the conquest of foreign markets. And he's also again pointing to how India was sort of pushed into, or compelled is the word, to produce raw materials for the industrialization of Britain, right? A new and international division of labor springs up, one suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and it converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other industrial part. Wow. So what you can see here, and he backs this up with lots of tables which you can look at in terms of the imports coming into England, right? A bit later on in volume 1, he develops a general law of accumulation, and the main example of the supply of cheap materials and cheap labor power is England's colonial relation with Ireland in the general law of accumulation. But so here, this is a bit more general. It's a sort of a general comment. It's highly suggestive. In actual fact, Karl Kautsky's theory of imperialism, 50 years on, is just based on this section. And, Kautsky's not got a good, not highly thought of for very good reasons because of his position on the First World War. But you can understand why somebody looking for a theory of imperialism and looking to Marx for inspiration would really fasten on to this this section, because he really does. He starts to spell out tendencies in his time which have become even more pronounced later on. Okay, and of course this whole discussion continued in the next big sort of theoretical generation of the 70s about unequal exchange, and we're back with it today. Okay, this question of the international division of labor. So this is a very interesting seed point that Marx gives us for this type of analysis. And it is quite striking in the same section that he also writes about boom and bust. And again, the focus is on cotton industry, but he's talking about the industrial cycle. And he says, there comes a time in every industrial cycle when a forcible reduction of wages beneath the value of labor power is attempted so as to cheapen commodities. Okay. He gives examples closer to home for some of us in Leicester and Coventry ribbon makers. I think Leicester shoemakers' wages were cut in half in the crisis, and Coventry ribbon makers had a reduction of 30 to 40% in their wages. So this is he gives over several pages a sort of like a mini history of the fortunes of capitalists and workers in the cotton industry in this section. Okay, what I want to do now is see how Marx puts together the interaction. He's actually writing a history of the capitalist mode of production in a sense, right? He does see it as going through stages. And at one level, it's linear. I mean, it starts off with handicraft and guilds. He looks at this sort of simple cooperation that we've looked at. He then moves on to manufacture, and he then on to machinery and artificial industry. And he does see them developing beyond the limits of the earlier stage or phase into a later one. And labor productivity increases all the time. And the driver is capital's push for surplus value and profit. But he also does look at, we're going to look at this in a minute, right? I'm just setting the scene in the following sections. He does look at what's the sort of the feedback loop. How does the introduction of machinery affect the division of labor in manufacture, and indeed in handicrafts as well? So this is quite a impressively extensive study. I mean, do they persist? What happens to them? Do they just follow on in some way, or do they change, right? And so he does return to quite a lot of the historical material that he's already introduced us to in chapter 10 with the, if you remember, in the latter half of the 18th century, in the very first decades of the 19th century, the capitalists in England pushed hard to extend the working day so they could exploit workers more. This is welcome to capitalism, welcome to capitalist exploitation, right? Now, he's actually covering this period again from the Industrial Revolution on, but he does it, really gives us a deeper analysis, I think, of what's going on. Of course, he's brought in how machinery is used by capitalism to increase relative surplus value, right? And again, this is just saying how far Marx got and how far beyond Marx to build on Marx we might want to go, right? In each of these stages, there would also have been a supply of raw materials. Again, to sort of really labor the point, we've already come across this with cotton, but you think of all the other raw materials. Okay, so even at the very earliest stages. So what you've got then is the idea that there may be some kind of similar developments or development of underdevelopment going on in parallel with the ones that are Marx's main focus. And again, to be really fair to Marx, I mean, he was aware of these, but he had to limit his scope. But these days we could look at these and take the story, take the story from this perspective. So what happened to, the provision of the materials coming into these different stages of production over this period? Okay, what he says is, first of all, handicraft production was overthrown, and he gives incredible degree of increase in productivity. So he's saying, if you look at what a machine can do in terms of needle manufacture, which was, sort of like Adam Smith's favorite example, the degree of increase in needles being produced by a day's work is just increased incredibly, right? That's a contemporary needle making machine, by the way. I mean, it's like you let me set it up and let it run. But, and this is the huge, interesting qualifier that is, a skim reading you could easily miss. Marx qualifies or develops what he's saying very heavily in terms of what the impact of the factory system had on manufacture, and in particular on domestic industry. And what you get, well, this is a slightly separate point, which is about the application of science, right? But what, again, he brings out is that the implementation of machine production introduced cheap labor. Capitalists introduced cheap labor to work with the machines, basically. And in particular, they took advantage of women and children, and he says unskilled workers as cheap labor. That's a direct quote. He says, as the English say, cheap labor, right? And he sees, we came across this before, if you remember, the watchmakers had all these external workers helping to make the different parts of the watch. This doesn't go away with machine production. And he said that there's an awful lot of external departments to the factory. Then they could be manufacturing workshops, and there could be other forms, as we'll see, of truly domestic production. Okay, so the exploitation of cheap and immature labor power is carried out in a more shameless manner in modern manufacture than in factory proper. So let's be careful what he's saying here. He's saying that manufacture persists alongside the factory. You still have workshops, and in those workshops, the exploitation of cheap and immature labor power is even more shameless. It's got a very modern resonance to it, in actual fact. So let's go on. This is modern manufacture. Okay, so he talks about it being highly brutalized, very unsuitable. He gives an example of brick making, where little girls basically are shifting bricks all through the day and halfway through the night. This is in England in the mid-19th century. Of course, it happens in other parts of the world to this day. And then he does write not only about modern manufacture, he writes about modern domestic industry. Now, I couldn't get a good image of domestic industry. This is a bit later. This is 1914. This is lace makers in Nottingham in a factory in 1914. But what you can see very evidently is that they're all in rows and working away. So you get what he said under corporation, which is some of the advantages of the capitalist of, common heating and light, reducing costs, right? But they're all working by hand. They're in rows, but they're actually making the lace by hand, these women workers, right? Okay. So he, in his time, what we can see here is that an awful lot of the lace making was actually done in small workshops, not in factories, but in small places, not necessarily at home, but in like workhouses, private houses run by mistresses. So in today's terms, this would be outsourcing, or what he calls external departments. And he says these wages are miserably low, and he says they got even worse by the truck system, whereby the workers had to buy food from the company store, basically. So what we've got is a persistence of these other, what you might think of as earlier forms, but they persist. And capitalist modern manufacture, modern industry, so large-scale industry includes these forms of organization of the labor process. Okay, and he talks about sheer abuse of women and children in order to reduce the cost, to cheapen. So, I mean, I'm struck by how much of this chapter deals with this type of issue alongside the introduction of machinery and the use of machinery as such, right? So you have this sort of like correlated development. Okay. Okay. Now he says, there we go. Large-scale industry, cheap human material. Remember those workers who were set free by large-scale industry, by machines in one place and use of machines going into agriculture. So you have a bigger pool of labor, labor markets being, labor's pouring into the labor market and is available for this other type of exploitation. So he's saying the scattered handicrafts and domestic industries continue to exist as a broad foundation. The great production of surplus value in these branches of labour, the progressive cheapening of their articles, were and are chiefly due to the minimum wages paid. Okay, and he goes on. Marx was quite optimistic about the sewing machine. Okay, so this is an article. These two young women are working using sewing machines. This is quite a recent article, and he's talking about garment making. So this is, well, it's a continuation of cotton, but you know, a later stage in the commodity chain, making of garments using cotton. And he says this is sure exploitation. I've just noticed the time. Might have to speed up a little bit. Okay, so the factory acts were generalized, and again, cheap labor keeps coming up. These outside departments. He said they were often ineffective, very limited, and he counterposes. Okay, we'll come on to his counterposition in a minute, right? He's saying that this way of dividing labor is still reminding the reader this is a capitalist rationale. And he does say, it's a sort of like this limited reform of the Factory Act, he counterposes to that what a real care for the worker would consist of. And he says this will only come about when the workers have political power. So he's talking about the need for revolution. And he makes similar comments in relation to the family and how capitalism introduces forms of exploitation, if you like, within the family. And he says, you know, you can only see a restoration of a different type of family by overthrowing this process of production. The generalization of factory acts is something which capital, once one sector of capital has to work under a factory act, they want to see it extended to the others because they all see it as unfair competition. Okay. And so there is a tendency for once it becomes, he argues, and this is very much where the national and the international might well differ. He argues that the sectors of capitalism which have to follow limits on labor begin to insist that the other sectors of capital have to do the same. And he basically then looks at workshops, not factories, but mining industry and agriculture. And again, incredible examples of low pay in these sectors before the factory acts are applied to them. So the acceleration of the factory acts beyond the sort of the spinning and the weaving where they started to other factory sectors and then into smaller workshops, he says will accelerate the concentration of capital. In other words, you're going to have bigger capitals making, you know, bigger points of production. Factories will be built, or the equivalent of factories in these other, and this will remove a safety valve. I don't think that that's quite. I mean, there's a truth to it, but like so many of these points, there's also a counteracting truth to it as well. And this is the, I think, the last section now, and I have accelerated a bit through these points, but I've just given you all a lot of references, so you don't want to read them in live, but you might want to look at them, right? His points on agriculture are very interesting. It's quite a short section, because he does say that I want to come back to this, and the way he comes back to it is in volume 3, right? But he makes a point which has been picked up in the recent literature, ecological point, which is, you can see it here, right, on this side, on page 639. Marx points out that capitalism destroys the soil, and even when it says it's improving the soil, it's actually destroying it. And he gets that from a chemical engineer called Liebig. So he says what you've also got is a rupture, a metabolic rupture between society and nature brought about by capitalism. And this is used by John Bellamy Foster as a sort of a starting point for a critique on ecological terms of the capitalist mode of production. Okay, these are now my last comments. I have speeded through because I want to get to these and leave time, obviously. If you want to look at an example, I do recommend the cotton mill, the mill, which is a dramatization. It's based on a slightly earlier period, but I was interested in just thinking about the numbers of workers. And as far as I can see from that dramatization, I haven't cross-checked it with any records, right? You have dozens of workers who are feeding the machines, tending machines. In that particular drama, the men are very much in the background, but the way they appear, it's sort of like as laborers. loading up the cotton bales or carting, stuff around, big stuff, right? There were 3 supervisors and 1 mechanic. So what was really mattered here were the age and gender differences in the workforce. That's really mattered, and you see the relative numbers as well, right? The other sort of point, which I think this chapter brings out very much, and I just want to comment on, is the varying ways in which this takes place. There's varying degrees of automation, there's various types of automation. And Marx makes a big thing about the self-acting machine. This is the spinning mule, and then weaving, the steam hammer which could hammer a nail onto a block of wood or compress a huge piece of steel, right? And he also draws attention to the use of the slide rest, which is used to control lathes and milling machines and other sort of metalworking machines, right? Then you have the machine system, where all the machines are connected up. And so that's a factory of machines, if you like, right? Which has a common motive source. And also he emphasizes organized flow. And he really anticipates Henry Ford on this, because that came a bit later. So the machine is going back to where we started, the machine enforces upon the worker the rhythm of their work. Okay. Now, there are some sectors where it was actually quite hard to engineer self-acting machines. So the machines are brought in, but they're still being used as tools. And I think that is the case for sewing machines, for example, right? They're not quite the same as the spinning mule, okay? I'm not sure there's a self-acting sewing machine. There might be one on the market, but you can see most sewing machines are still being used as tools by workers who make the garments, right? And when that happens, what also happens, and this is a 20th century development, it's a sort of return to the division of labor issue, right? Which is then the capital focuses on making the worker work as a machine. If they can't get rid of the worker, then they're going to press them as hard as they can through time and motion studies and so on to be as close as possible to what a machine would be in order to control costs, basically. And there are some sectors where it is harder to mechanize. It doesn't make them non-capitalist. It just means that they're hard to mechanize capitalist sectors. Okay. Yeah, so there's a continuation of these external departments. Okay, now all of these combinations are being developed by capitalism in all kinds of different ways, right? But all of them involve both the technical aspect and the costing aspect. Now, I haven't directly commented, although I've given lots of sort of information from Marx about this question of increased oppressive exploitation, increasing surplus value. And I just refer back to my other lecture, because in a way I covered it there. But I think, there's a lot of evidence that the sort of incipient idea of surplus value being increased by paying workers less and treating vulnerable sections worse runs through this chapter without doubt. These are just some comments for the reading group. And we can come back to that in the reading group, I think, about how to cover the rest of this chapter. I do emphasize section 7, but that's to my taste, so you can look at it and see what you think. Yeah, I'll come back to these if we've got time. And I just want to advertise this book by Marini is now out, thanks to Amanda Latimer and Jaime Osorio. And I'm hopeful that we will Nottingham Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice will host, thankfully, a seminar of that in the spring. Okay, that's the lecture, so we can stop recording.
Okay.